normally do a YouTube rundown for these sorts of things, but as the channel has grown considerably over the last year, I figured I'd extend the plug for these bands by pivoting to video as well, as the vernacular goes. But if you do want to check out these albums, I have also included them in a blog post over at Hate Meditations if you prefer the written word to the uttered word. But stuff on YouTube tends to get far more eyeballs on shit anyway, so I figured I'd extend the plug for bands that deserve more of said eyeballs on their shit to this realm as well. I will admit it though, I did have a wobble last year as far as my faith in the quality of metal is concerned, but I would say that pound for pound since COVID, metal has been steadily improving, or at the very least been growing more interesting and warranting more talking points over the last 4 or 5 years or so. So I went into shortlisting for this year expecting to barely scrape together a handful of bands, but actually I've struggled to keep this list south of 40, which I normally intend to do anyway. But yeah, it's seen both events happening in the overground and the underground, and it's been that rare synergy of both fields where both feel like there has been an uptick in quality from all the pieces that I've been reading anyway. Blood Incantation's long forecasted return has undoubtedly sparked a lot of people talking about the same fucking thing in metal, which very rarely happens. You always get these sort of isolated streams of people talking about entirely different worlds, and you kind of, at the end of the year, everyone compiles their lists, and everyone's like, who the fuck are these bands? But the return of a band of this sort of popularity of Blood Incantation, whatever you think of their quality, has at least been an event, and we don't really get many events in metal anymore, unless it's a band that's over like 30 years old, or, you know, a legacy act releasing another comeback album. Read Judas Priest, for example, who were the other major talking point this year, but a band of their vintage is bound to attract that kind of attention. So yeah, that's been interesting to witness, along with a number of sort of mid-tier in terms of popularity death and black metal bands chugging along, releasing, you know, semi-quality material in defiance of like you know, their age or the sort of current trends in music, which has also been, well, it's keeping us out of trouble, hasn't it? Yeah. So, but it's also, you know, on a more personal level, it's seen the return of some of my pet favourites in the likes of Mephitis, Polemicist, and Betrayal, along with some welcome surprises from the underground in the likes of Valadir, an Italian black metal band, Death Like Dawn, who are very interesting, and again, Chilean bands such as Critical Defiance. There's always a handful of Chilean bands in my end of the year list now, especially in the realm of death and thrash metal. And this has really been in stark contrast to what I thought was a rather tepid year last year, with the exception of a Demoniac, again from Chile, or a Martha and a handful of others. But yeah, 2023 felt like a bit of a dry spot, but I think that was an exception in the post-COVID years, as far as I'm concerned. I think the quality has been on the uptick. As far as my wobble in faith, I think you could chalk it up to the fact that I'm a relatively new father and my free time is much more precious now, and it's just make me liable to resent spending it on subpar or outright terrible music. But yeah, metal has steadily become more interesting, more exciting, as much as it is frustrating. But if you, like I do a lot of the time, feel like keeping up with new music is becoming increasingly a chore, a labour, rather than a labour of love, it's okay. I'm here to help. I'm here to help. I don't intend to add loads of new releases to your already probably lengthy listening queues, apart from the fact that that's exactly what I'm doing. So just delete your shitty queue and replace it with mine. I guarantee you'll be better off for it. In this video, I'm pretty much going to be paraphrasing what's on the blog post. So if you've already read that, then yeah, you probably can just switch off now. Toodaloo, it's the same releases, it's the same words. But what I'm going to be doing here is just a fun little tier list. I'm doing this as a tier list just to disguise the fact that this is a dispassionate auditing event, which I expect you, the viewer, to put yourself through for some bizarre reason, which I'm sure some of you might actually do. Let's do them alphabetically. Right off the bat, I should say, expect mispronunciations if this is the first time you've watched one of my videos. First up, we've got So this band haven't This band haven't put anything out for many years. I think their last album was sometime in the mid 2000s, so it's been nearly 20 years since they've actually done anything. But it kind of comes across as a series of medleys without really being a coherent sound document in any way. Melissa Gray's vocals are still a delight to listen to, and she boasts like one of the most expressive ranges within extreme metal voices that you're likely to hear within the genre. But the pacing on Bleed on My Teeth is such that one comes away with the impression that the band was simply unable to settle on a style or even specific riffs without shifting gear halfway through. One could practically hear the compromises in the studio as the writing process unfolded, to be honest. Remains, though, a kind of residual joy in the sheer chaos and the aggression of the performance here. It's an overwhelmingly malevolent release, but the binding vision, it's just lacking. So this one is going straight into the D tier. Now, this is going to be a problem because the tier list I've got here is S, A, B, C, and D, and I've only listed them in 4 tiers. This is going to get wild. Next up is Chili's Antagonize, Interpretations of the Unknown Wilderness. And this sort of, in a lot of ways, it reminds me of an evolution of the style that the Chasm really kind of developed and cornered in the death metal market. But it meets it with a direct, efficient, and borderline utilitarian compositional method, I would say. Its blunt, linear thrash collides against drab doom licks and an alien, undulating death metal tangents deployed as milestones indicating key transitional moments. Its sort of melodic doom plays a role in juxtaposing with the blunt object of a formative South American thrash influence that's still discernible in this release. It's just all bound together with an underlying commitment to unsettling monstrosity through illogical and at times frantically disruptive deviations, which is another example of how Chile is pulling far ahead in the death metal and thrash metal terrain as far as the competition is concerned, with almost every band in the last few years putting out material that's just worth dropping everything for. So this one is going straight in at A and is or S even. It's funny how it changed and I just didn't. Is a strong contender for being my release of the year. Next up is Mercantile. This is a German black metal entity who are quite a late entry into the game. This coming out on the 13th of December, I believe. But the combination of like warm, energetic, occult black metal with some really, really creative melodic work just made me think I need to include this in the end of the year list because it really is something quite special. It's energetic, it's warm, and as I said, it's occultist black metal, and it has this sense of high theatre going on about it. It's just subtle but very, very effective gestures towards epic narratives and so on. and so on. So the first thing to note about this album is that the bass is the lead instrument, but they don't treat this as a novelty in any way, shape or form. And obviously they're hardly the first to do this within black metal. Obviously Necromantia being the most obvious example, but I think Mercantile are definitely the most successful since Necromantia in kind of carrying this through and making it seem natural and not something that they're trying to sort of shove in the listener's face to make themselves stand out. The music carries enough character that one can kind of forget the oddities in order to appreciate the piece in the round, as it were, in the round, as they say in the corporate world. As an intellectual exercise, it is interesting to note the various ways Mercantile have overcome the limitations of the bass when set against, say, layers of atmospheric distorted guitar. Tireless drum work kind of compensates for some of this by filling in the gaps as far as texture is concerned. They also deploy a sporadic church organ tone, or they just take the time and the effort to craft melodies that stick in the mind far longer than a good portion of modern metal releases do anyway. So yeah, this album is a late entry, but it's a delightful black metal oddity, and I'm going to put this straight in at A. I think we're going to use this little nook here that I didn't realize was there, the A tier, because it's not quite up there with Antagonize. I don't think it's going to stand the test of time as much, but it is definitely a very, very promising debut. Next up, an old hat entry now with Black Funeral. Anyone that's unfamiliar with this act, they're one of the pillars of formative USBM. They also known as being probably one of the most divisive. They kind of swing from very, very feral, obscurantist, noise, come industrial black metal over to very, very kind of laid back, ethereal, melodic black metal, and my podcasting buddy Tyler always compares them to sort of early Gorgoroth in that way. And this latest album is definitely swinging to that latter category. And whilst it didn't wow me, it's always like black funeral material is always worthy of a headline, just because it reliably does spark some talking points in the scene. And this is an artist, bear in mind, that used to delight in sort of provoking the scene quite a lot, and sort of, I wouldn't say deliberately, but definitely has sparked some pretty strong opinions against them in a manner sort of comparable to someone like an Iljan. But as I Dahak and The Waters of Weeping, they're sort of the albums that really are top shelf as far as kind of noise industrial black metal are concerned. And Michael Ford, its mastermind, is steeped in his occultist material. He's written books on it. He's a member of the Church of Lucifer, blah, 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 and he's very, very into the mythological aspects of this project. And this sort of does elevate what in lesser hands could be sometimes quite stale material. And there is real world building on this album as well, don't get me wrong, but it does just feel a little bit derivative, despite the fact that there are quotations and returning characters across this album from black metal history. The ruthless familiarity of the presentation all speak of an artist that's perhaps maybe a little too happy to rest on their laurels, given that they are slightly older, and maybe just write the occasional love letter to the scene. So this one is going to slip next to the Adoria, right in the D category there. Woo! Okay, we are off. Warhammer.
In the clearing, the circle is set at the dark of the moon. Listen to the brook's call, the eternal song of its burbling along. The eternal song of its burbling along. A dreamlike state of consciousness.
I was looking forward to this debut a lot. I rated their debut EP very, very highly, cutting wood for magical purposes, and that is essentially what the Warhammer project is all about. This is a German black metal entity that calls more back to the heavy metalisms of like maybe the Greek school, or more importantly stuff like Masters, Hammer and Roots in Czech Republic, or Czechia as it's now known. And that's kind of where these guys come at the genre. They're not interested in the frigid Nordic style so much. Theirs is a much warmer and much more like classically heavy metal riff based approach to black metal. And, you know, there's a touch of black and thrash in there as well. But this is all kind of, all of these riffs and so on, they are familiar in a way, but they're placed in such a sort of setting that they are kind of put in service of what feels like a piece of high drama. You feel like you're witnessing a ritual, and the riffs kind of are just playing off that as a sort of an accompaniment to it, more like an opera or something. I hesitate to use the word because it sounds frightfully overwrought, but that is kind of what it comes across as. It's utterly eccentric and it's shamelessly fun, and for that kind of thing to work in an artistic way is remarkable, because that kind of black metal, or that kind of extreme metal in general, comes across normally as terribly obnoxious, but Warhammer have a very unique sensibility in the way they go about this. Their focus on the occult is kind of quite literal in a way. They deploy the music as a mere soundtrack to this ritual magic. So yeah, it's a really interesting album, thoroughly enjoyable debut. It did not disappoint. I think this one is going straight into the A category as well, though. No, I will not explain. Rodequin. Obviously, I'd heard of these guys before. Brutal death metal. Not usually my cup of tea, but if you add a medieval flavour to it, I'll obviously be all over it. Even setting aside the sort of medievalist aesthetic these guys go for, they are kind of idiosyncratic as far as brutal death metal is concerned, to the point where I wouldn't even want to call them that, because brutal death metal trades on very, very disruptive tempo changes, and sort of always acts like it's pulling itself apart, only to be pieced back together again in very chimerical and sort of Frankensteinian ways. Whereas Brodequin are much more linear. The tempo changes, they are there, but they make much more sense as far as the listener is concerned. The rhythms are much more linear. There's much more of almost like a grindcore undercurrent to some of this, despite the fact that some of the songs are much longer than that. But it's sort of a persistent rhythmic pulse that kind of drives this music forward and gives it a sense of kind of intentionality and malevolence that is sometimes missing from other forms of technical or brutal death metal that make a point of sort of coming apart at the seams with the amount of stuff and information that is just packed within each bar. And yeah, whilst it is possible for it to feel like a gimmick, I feel like for these reasons this is not a gimmick. And Brodequin, they do, in limiting themselves in this way, the music comes across as persistently violent, which is fitting for the theme of sort of medieval torture. And they do deploy the occasional nod to classical melodic forms within the choppy chromatic kind of undercurrents as well, and they supplement the relentless atonal attack and the monomaniacal rhythm section. It all makes this a very, very curious release within the current death metal landscape. I'm going to stop justifying where I place these things. I'm just going to place them, and we'll have to live with it. So Brodequin's slipping in right at B, because we haven't had one yet, and I don't think it's quite as interesting as some of the stuff currently sat at A. Next up, we have another old hat artist in Cardiac Arrest. These death metal veterans, and their previous album, I remember what the fuck it was called. Let's have a look, shall we? Metal Archives, Cardiac Arrest. Because it was again on my list for album of the year. The Day That Death Prevailed, yes. And that was released in 2020. Oh, it was a 2020 release. Yeah, I remember buying the cassette back then. And that kind of reached for Legion levels of unbridled chaotic energy. And it really was like, it wasn't a sort of wildly mold-breaking death metal album, but it was just a really, really good execution of that style of very, very sort of barbaric, feral, just muscular death metal. It was a really, really strong contender for Album of the Year in 2020. This one fell short. The underlying menace is still there, and they are ostensibly old school, but they still feel very modern, and that is also to their credit. And they stand apart for their ability to renew archaic forms with this modernist sense of urgency, but this lacks the bite of the predecessor, I really must say, and it's noteworthy more for the death metal geeks or even the cardiac arrest geeks, but I think newcomers to this band will find this very, very skippable, so I think I'm going to place this in C. Lovable, but troubled. Next up, Clactonian. This one is a more obscure release, but if anyone has heard of Thecodontian, it's made up of some of the guys from that project, the Italian black come death come grind bass and drum only, I should say, sort of prehistoric themed metal. It sounds way better than it sounds on paper, trust me. But this is just a debut EP from them. It's a cacophonous and obscurantist black and grind affair, basically. It also features members of Ashen Tomb, I should mention. It's hubristic in its treatment of the well-trodden ground of that dark, grindcore-inspired black metal in the style of Beherit and Blasphemy, obviously. And whilst a murky haze lurks over the music with a suffocating vigor, Clactonians set themselves apart with an unusually pronounced melodic character, I would say, alongside a basket of riffs one would normally associate with the darker aspects of death grind, a la Blood or something. So yeah, short but very, very promising EP from these guys. So I'm going to whack this straight in at B as well. If I can find it in my little list here. There it is. Going to just grab a beer. So talk amongst yourselves while I pour this. For anyone that's come here from that politics video, by the way, thanks for subscribing and watching, first of all. There were a lot of comments on that video, and I was a little bit overwhelmed by the response. This is a small channel, and we don't normally get that kind of coverage. Some of the comments were really, really engaging, really grappling with some of the topics that I tried to address. I should say a 1 hour video on the politics of metal will never do the topic justice, and I will also freely admit I probably could have unpacked the relationship with hardcore a lot more and gone for a much less Western perspective, as I keep mentioning stuff like Chilean metal. That's just one example among many where I could have maybe branched out away from Europe and North America to some extent. But the amount of pearl clutching, metal video, the amount of pearl clutching that you hear over a couple of burps is it's really quite remarkable. I didn't realise the scene had grown so chaste. Na Ultrini. Now, this is another latecomer, released on the 27th of December, but I knew this one was coming because I fucking loved their debut. And they really did take some risks with this follow-up. This is expressed not just through their much more pronounced heavy metal influence that comes through, it supplements their Burzum-esque, very driving, trance-like take on black metal, but there's also a good deal of folk influences in a much more explicit way than Burzum ever did. That makes its way into the contours of the riffs as well. On top of that, the songs are paced out in more accessible chunks in almost, pop adjacent kind of way, rather than the sort of linear flowing black metal narrative that we found on the debut. There's a clear lead and rhythm section sort of splitting apart as well, in a way that, most rock is formed, which is very, very distinct from black metal, which all tends to flow in the same direction as a continuous stream of melodic information. Whilst none of that in and of itself is bad, after all, selling out is only really negative insofar as it dulls the musical ambition of different artists. The money is really just a side effect of that. But marshalling these more commercial elements together, it could have spelled disaster in lesser hands. But Kump's identity was already so well formed by this point that, and it carried through on this, was already so well formed on the debut, and they carried it through in this follow-up, that it contains, elevates, or otherwise enhances the more accessible elements they've deployed on this album. The result is powerful, it's emotive, it's dignified, and it brings together the brighter, more hopeful aspects of, say, non-extreme metal to bear on dark, long-form black metal. By that I mean the bright aspects of folk metal and heavy metal and so on, but it sort of integrates this into still very dark black metal vision. And I should say this is the second in a trilogy. It works as like a prequel to the debut album, and the themes on this are much more human focused. It's still very preoccupied with time and place and nature and wilderness and forgetting and remembering, as far as like humanity's relation to the land is concerned. But it's much less preoccupied with destruction and violence than the debut was. So yeah, it's a work that is very, very intriguing and very, very daring. But because this was only released a few days ago, although I caught the promo because it's going to take a little while to unpack this further. But absolutely one of my albums of the year. This is going straight in at S tier all the way. Where is it in my list? There it is. Up you go there, son. Just have a sip of this. Next up, down to Chile again. Coffin Curse, The Continuous Nothing. Now, this is on the weaker side as far as Chilean death metal is concerned. It is reminiscent of maybe early Vader in spirit, if not in actual content. There's a vestigial thrash influence is clearly present, but more importantly, it leans into the dense, frantic, almost bombastic violence within death metal innovated on something like Slayer's Reign in Blood, but most profoundly expressed on, again, Deicide's Legion, very important album. And whilst the knowledge and ability is not lacking here, the intent is mired in an over-eagerness to stuff these pieces with maybe too much activity. It's a little bit, the message is a little bit clouded under all of that. So yeah, this is going in at the D tier. I should say, as I'm placing these, that although we do have tiers on here and we are ranking them kind of arbitrarily in a lot of ways, I am also keen to point out that all of the albums on here are winners to me. So Coffin Curse, in you go there. Am I missing? Oh no, there it is. They're all winners to me. So even if they're in at D, they are at least noteworthy for one reason or another. Next up, over to Texas, Condemner. Now, this is an artist I've been following for a long time, and we had main man Paul on here on the podcast a few weeks ago to chat about this album and Condemner in general and his views on metal. Very, very thoughtful guy, got a lot of interesting ideas, suggest you listen to it. And their debut album released back in 2018, I think it was, really did catch my eye for its ability to meld the American death metal sensibility taken from the, I'd say, sort of Floridian, I should say, Deicide, Morbid Angel in particular, and mesh it with a much more kind of American black metal take, i.e., in particular bands like Profanatica, stuff like that. Maybe a touch of Von in there as well. This album goes in, for my mind, more of an incantation direction. That goes much more blunt, repetitive. It goes long form, and it's very, very austere in the way it's presented. There's no technicality here, no showing off, no sort of fluffy edges. It's just riff, 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 recapitulation, riff, riff, riff. And in that sense, they take a sledgehammer to the sort of the perhaps overly lavish facade of modern death metal and just sort of chip away at it. They chip away at the elaborate archways and the vestiges of a genre, that has strayed far from the path of lucidity or relevance. They select only the most sort of foundational elements of death metal from the rubble, and so the project of world building can begin anew. I would say that this is a step sideways for Condemner, though. I wouldn't say it builds on the predecessor. It's maybe a brief clarifying moment, or clarifying provocation, I should say, so the wider extreme metal landscape. It's a reminder to anyone willing to listen that the raw materials of the past are still viable building blocks. They are there. You don't have to be retro or pastiche when you do this. You can take the raw materials of the classics of death metal and still build something new with it without being more complex than them. Blah, 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 blah. If anything, you could be simpler than them in a lot of ways, as this album is. These elements are there to be configured into endless forms if one has the patience and the guile to administrate the resources, the bountiful resources that one has at one's disposal, without getting lost in the weeds of being overly intelligent with how key works, tempo works, guitar tone, all of the things that modern musicians tend to get too worked up on, the minutiae of the details, without thinking just about the wider macro picture and how it's all fitting together, and trying to be more complex than their predecessors. It's not always necessarily the case that you need to do that, without necessarily going down the old school death metal route of just writing pop music with entombed riffs and so on. Anyway, it's a challenging album. I wouldn't say it's sort of enjoyable to listen to, but it's definitely thought-provoking. So this one is going to go in the B category, I think. There it goes. Next up is another wild card, Cosmic Jaguar. From Ukraine. This one, not come across these guys before this year, but it landed on my desk, and my first thought was, this is obnoxious as hell. It's kind of a prime example of some of those things I was just mentioning in my discussion of Condemner, but a second run kind of made me think of Atheist's Jupiter in some ways, and not that I'm a huge fan of that album, but I thought if they are in the sort of region of what Atheists were doing, it's at least worth looking into them again. And their genre loyalty is perhaps on thinner ice than Atheists ever was, despite the fact that Atheists were known for their sort of blending of different styles and eras together, well outside of metal. But Cosmic Jaguar go even further in sort of combining, well, elements of South American Aztec sort of music in there, particularly in the sort of percussion that they use and the use of pan flutes and things like that. They will find their way into the mix alongside this very progressive, obviously technical form of death metal. So it's kind of on the border of being a cacophonous, confusing mess, and actually a really well-crafted slab of progressive metal with a very, very distinct identity. So I'm being a bit sort of tantric in my approach to venturing an actual opinion on this fucking album. So I'll just clarify that I think it is pretty fucking great. I'm going to put this though. Paul will never forgive me if I rank it higher than his album. So I'm gonna put it on the B tier. Where is it in my little list? There it is. Cosmic Jaguar. You're in good company on the B tier. Trust me, guys. Next up, Critical Defiance. We're off to Chile again. So, The Search Won't Fall. Yes, this is a clear continuity with the past as far as thrash metal is concerned. All thrash, to my mind, carries that nostalgia baggage to some extent. For me, thrash, it is the sort of stepping stone from metal in the wider sense to extreme metal. It's the little kind of the bridge that connects the two, both in terms of time, in terms of the chronology of the evolution of metal, but also in terms of technique and, well, extremity as well. But good thrash always just inherently feels pastiche in a lot of ways. By, say, 1990, after that point when it kind of collapsed into irrelevance, it never really recovered in the same way that black metal and death metal managed to become more contemporary versions of themselves with, mixed success in a lot of ways. But thrash never really managed that to the same extent. And I would say Chilean bands like Demoniac and Critical Defiance are really kind of righting this wrong by being very, very recognizably thrash, without sort of being overly, again, pastiche, Municipal Waste, for example, or just sounding like sort of tired clones of the past. And Critical Defiance, the key to their success, you can't really place your finger on anything in particular. It's just really, really good thrash done well. But they do integrate elements of death metal and black metal in there, along with, no small amount of heavy metal as well. But they treat these features more as a starting point, a foundation onto which to place all manner of modules and intriguing sort of melodic divergencies. It's very, very intelligently written music, despite the fact that it's very frantic and fast-paced. And this is what distinguishes it from nostalgia. It's not trying to reference the past too heavily, even though it does. It's kind of almost incidental in the way that it does that. It's the fluidity of the genre hopping. It could just as easily go unnoticed for the sake of enjoying the piece in the round, as they say. It appears to be a common feature of thrash and death metal coming out of Chile, I will say. It's not a clear break with the past. If anything, it's very, very proud of its continuity with the past, but it's a sense of a rehabilitation. It's updating the past into an entity fit for confronting this contemporary complex moment that we find ourselves in. So again, this is absolutely S tier for me all the way. So in it goes. Into the S. Let me just check how many I've got left down here. Quite a few to get through. We better speed up. Next up, we're off to Colombia. Culto Licantropo. Now, this guy is from a band called Condor, who are one of the best death doom outfits going at the moment in their ability to combine that genre with elements of black metal and very, very understated sort of neo-folk and neo-classical to some extent, and alongside really, really quality heavy metal riffing. So yeah, this is the solo project of one of the guys from Condor, and much like that project, it weaves a fascinating tapestry of melodic currents. This time, sort of brought from raw black metal, and which underpins its riff package in a lot of ways. It's leveraging what feels like, again, elements of doom and death metal to elevate elements of the notoriously stale at times kind of surface level facade of black metal. And in some respects, this EP is going beyond like metal because it does sort of undertake an alchemy with things like folk and medievalism and even sort of contemporary experimental electronica to some extent. But to be honest, anything associated with the Condor project warrants you to drop everything and pay close attention to it. And this very, very short but rewarding EP is no exception. So this one is going straight in the A tier. Oh, I should have mentioned, you won't have heard of any of these releases, by the way. Next up, Darkestra, Nomad. This is probably one of the more popular releases now that I've just said that. It was released on Osmos, a fucking massive label. Darkestra, I was new to these guys when they released this, and I went back over their back catalogue and I was left a little bit underwhelmed. I think this is a massive step up for them as far as like combining the heavy black folk epic metal innovated by the likes of Bathory and developed by Graveland, and imitated by everyone from Primordial to Russian and Ukrainian NS bands. But the substance of their latest effort, Nomad, consists of marching paced heavy metal riffing. It's impressive for the amount of information it manages to convey with very little substance or complexity going on. This is very kind of understated, austere, kind of stripped back approach to creating epic metal, which doesn't really allow for any distraction away from just the main through line of the melodic narrative. And Darkestra have delivered a detailed and dignified surprise of sort of modern epic hybrid metal that it both celebrates its component parts, but it is more than the sum of these parts in general. So yeah, a very, very impressive release, but not usually my wheelhouse. So arbitrarily going to chuck this in at C. Next up, we've got a live album, Dead Space Chamber Music and Haptipicato. Kyoto. This is a collaboration between two artists, one of whom, Dead Space Chamber Music in particular, is one of my new favourite bands. Oh, I say new favourite bands, I've been following them for a few years now, but to sum them up, it's quite difficult, but I would say basically they're an English Dead Can Dance, but that really doesn't do justice to the originality of and the kind of innovation and musical experimentation that's going on in their sound. It's very kind of mix of neo-folk, medieval, classical, drone, noise, industrial. You get the picture. And this is a sort of an improvised recording of two very, very long tracks, both half an hour long. Where they basically improvise with this other duet, I believe they are, called Haptipicato, at the Crypt of St. John on the Wall. And it really kind of elevates their ability to manipulate arcane musical forms with the sort of cold, clinical modernism of drone and industrial and the sort of rhythmic regularity of percussive noise and so on, with this very, very organic, human, sort of ancient kind of sense of expression, both vocally but also melodically as well. And there's random flecks of traditional music going on inside this kind of drone of very, very industrial noise, but it's also a very, very meditative, chanting, kind of trance-like piece to listen to. It's really, really interesting and anachronistic in a lot of ways. So yeah, absolutely up there as far as albums from this year are concerned. I'm going to add this straight in at A, because anything this band are doing right now seems to turn to gold. Death Like Dawn. This is another black metal artist that I was not familiar with, but they caught me off guard with this one. Among the Graves of the Archetypes. It bucks the trend for what I would essentially call riff-based black metal over atmospheric black metal. These are very, very arbitrary designations that I'm giving, but a riff-based black metal band would be something like 1349. Atmospheric-based black metal band would be something like Lustra. Anyway, this bucks a trend in that it is like materially riff-based black metal, but it treats sort of jagged dissonance as a starting point and not an end in itself, like something like Death Spell Amiga would do, where it's just dissonance is the only thing. It's sort of the aim rather than the starting gun, as one might put it. But Death Like Dawn, they get a lot of currency out of like this binary of interplay between light and dark, good and evil, etc. Which, you know, obviously they're, as far as like musical expressions are concerned, they're old as music itself, but they managed to sort of integrate each undercurrent in a much more effective way than a lot of black metal bands do, and they caveat each of the themes with its opposite in a way that is really, really intriguing, actually. So again, I think this one warrants further study. I was actually listening to it earlier today on a health walk. So yeah, very, very curious release. This one is going in at A. I don't normally like to do this with artists that I'm not too familiar with, but I've given this album quite a few spins now, and it just keeps unfolding in weird ways. So yeah, check it out. Next up is possibly the biggest artist on my list today, Deceased. On paper, they're such a straightforward prospect, but when you actually hear them, they are a really, really sort of weighty undertaking. They're like a fucking 5-course meal, any one of their albums. They're all over an hour long, and they're just stuffed with information. It's this cacophony of old school thrash, obviously death metal as they used to be in the past, but not so much anymore. Sort of very, very sweeping, epic, melodic heavy metal, elements of sort of fucking King Diamond as well. And yeah, really, really strong punk element to them as well. And it's all bound together with this love of horror films, sci-fi, all that kind of stuff. And it's just this really, really weighty prospect. And yeah, on this, they didn't delight as much as sort of their previous efforts, but Children of the Morgue is the latest in a long line of this sort of dense, filling kind of music that we get from Deceased. And it doesn't quite live up to their predecessors, but that's just because their predecessors were that strong, as far as I'm concerned. There's this sort of sense that sometimes you're listening to a pop punk album, but it has this boundless percussive energy. It's a cornucopia of delights as far as heavy speed thrash metal riffs in their armory are concerned, and Fowley's near unstoppable enthusiasm for basically narrative storytelling. It makes any sort of contemporary Deceased album sort of worth sort of paying attention to, I would say. But for me, not quite up to par. Is that what we say? Par. So it's going in at C. This is another one that made a lot of headlines when it came out. I was not fussed with their debut, but this one, they didn't do anything particularly obvious as far as tweaking their sound, but they just all of the same elements was all reconfigured slightly, and suddenly you get a really, really quality kind of lo-fi but epic slab of black metal in the sort of tradition of stuff that's derived from Celtic frost before the Norwegian style became sort of the hegemonic, as the video essayists say. Hegemony. The video essay culture is just a byproduct of the fact that we produce too many humanities degrees graduates and not enough jobs for them to do. So they all landed up on YouTube and they use words like ontology, hegemony. What's that other one? Parse. They use that word. I'm finding this difficult to parse, as in process or understand. It's just fuck off, guys. Wait, Departure Chandelier. They sort of reference early Dark Throne, maybe some of the bigger names of the Nordic set, but they kind of integrate that with sort of elements of Graveland, I would say, sort of these mid-90s non-Nordic bands. And they have a very, very good sense of how to deliver a melodic hook within an extended long-form narrative. This could be expressed through an intermittent guitar hook or a really, really effective keyboard line, or they do sometimes do just very, very effective riffs with like punky power chord driven playing. But that these in turn find their harmonic counterpart through the deployment of clever keyboards as well. This all kind of amounts to very, very, it articulates their historic epic vision really, really well. And it's really just a very, very quality piece of intelligent black metal writing. So for that reason, it's not going into the S tier, but I would say it's definitely warrants an A. So up you go. You can already see I was impressed with 2024 just looking at the curve here. Let's see who we've got left. We've got a few more left to place. So let's see how it looks by the end of play today. We have Dipygus. With their self-titled. Now, Dipygus, I came across with their previous effort, Bushmeat. Great name for an album, by the way. This is sort of Dipygus writes psalms for mutants, basically. They're essentially autopsy, but autopsy for a modern age, for a more contemporary moment. They're sort of evolutionary death metal. They're not old school death metal in any sort of obvious sense. I sort of say it's a surrealist recapitulation of early autopsy, but there is something, well, in the surrealism of it, there is something left of center about their subject matter that catches the eye. That's sort of the idea of mutants and Neanderthals and lost kind of weird cannibalistic species and stuff living out in the jungle. Obviously, it's all very sort of what's the word? It invokes a certain kind of B movie, shall we say, and they do sample a lot of B movies and things like of that nature across their albums, but it's essentially a manifesto on how to make death metal weird again, to the point of being actually quite abrasive about it. Yet it still draws a clear and coherent connections with the tradition of death metal, most obviously through autopsy, but they do borrow from other artists as well, and it's recognizably this album is the latest, recognizably in a long and proud lineage within the genre, but one that teases and pushes and plugs holes in the boundaries of the form, almost to the point of breaking it. But it results in an unsettling and cloying and sweaty kind of atmosphere that I find it oddly addictive in a lot of ways. I am going to put this on A as well, and we are going to fast run out of space on this tier. So, Nipperhallen the next. anyone familiar with modern black metal should be familiar with this artist. They're a Swedish solo outfit that kind of, I don't know. I don't know how you describe these guys. They're blunt and traditional, but in a really, really weird way. They kind of borrow the jagged melodicism of early Burzum and maybe Dark Throne circa Under a Funeral Moon. No small amount of Emperor in there as well, but they dial up the symphonics and the intensity of this sound to the point where it feels like your speakers aren't quite able to capture everything. And I know that sounds probably a little bit hyperbolic, but I swear it's true. The speakers appear to be sort of cutting out the limits at either end in the mix because just the sound is so full of stuff. It's so compressed and the textures are too thick and there's too many layers of guitars and synths and the drums just won't stop blasting. But I find it such an immersive, weird experience at times. There's no particular originality to it. Like the riffs, like I said, they're derivative of stuff from Norway, second wave, but they are worth paying attention to. And maybe if I was sort of maybe clutching at straws, they do accent the gothic horror vocabulary of black metal riffing to a greater extent than second wave bands did. Even though the likes of Irsan and stuff has gone on record as saying they were listening to a lot of like horror film scores alongside the classic Merciful Fate and Bathory and so on, which was a huge inspiration for them. And obviously if you play a lot of black metal riffs on a keyboard or on synths, it sounds like horror music. Nipperhallen, but there's a sense in which they kind of try to repress that to some extent, but Nipperhallen really bring it to the fore in a lot of ways. Unoriginal but never uninteresting, I guess I would say. And nothing comes across as an afterthought. Everything is well sculpted and fleshed out. It is a silly outfit, but definitely one that puts a lot of effort into everything that they do. Folkstorm, I should say, was ostensibly their second album, but it was never actually released. Originally written and recorded back in 2016. So this one is going on the list just because we were only able to listen to it this year. Ultimately, it's that interaction of this highly familiar black metal kind of vocabulary or language, furniture is what I wrote in my notes actually. It's this combined with the fact that there's a degree of ornamentation and extravagance and opulence about this release that is an order of magnitude above what a lot of sort of contemporary pastiche black metal artists managed to achieve. So yeah, this one's going straight in at S, and no, I will not explain myself. Next up is Grand Demise of Civilization. This is an American black metal band with an album called Blaze of Abaddon. Again, another new one for me, bit left field as far as I'm concerned. It's kind of telling that these guys also play in death metal bands when they're not in Grand Demise of Civilization, because this album is archetypical of death metal musicians playing black metal, with all the pros and cons that come with that. What do I mean by that? Well, as a rule of thumb, for me, death metal is a more composed form of extreme metal. Black metal, by contrast, is the art of doing more with less. Black metal is always more than the sum of its parts, whereas death metal is not necessarily the opposite of that, but it is very, very intentional and overactive in a lot of ways. It's intentionally dense. It's intentionally overcomposed. Whilst the atmosphere and texture and stuff they're key ingredients in the distinction that I'm making here. I think established wisdom overplays the importance of this. It's the overreach of black metal that is key. It reaches above and beyond what it's capable of as far as like pure music is concerned. I know that's probably a bit of a generalization now, given that black metal has become an incredibly technical and dense form of music in its own right, but in spirit, that is sort of the key difference for me. And I've picked this album out because despite the fact that it has that lurking sense of overly zealous middle management, i.e. death metal musicians playing black metal, There is a really intimate knowledge of how to create long form compositions, and how to give that a clear aesthetic vision, and how to bring all of these elements together. It's conceptually loose enough that it kind of leaves enough to the imagination, and it's modest by design, but it's rich in its ability to create these sonic tapestries. It's very, very intuitive and flowing, and it understands black metal as the leveraging of these disparate elements, i.e., techniques, forms, vibes, and contrast, and so on, into basically a project of world building in a lot of ways, and it's really, really good at that. All that being said, it still falls short in a lot of ways, because of the fact that it still comes across as, I would say, an afterthought, but just not quite as dedicated as some of the other outfits on here. So this one's going in at a healthy C, let's say. Next up, we have China's Holy Arrow. Holy Arrow are an artist I've been following for a while because they combine a marked heavy metal sensibility with melodic black metal, essentially, but in a way that is much more raw and genuine than a lot of artists that work in that kind of field are. Theirs has always been a proudly heavy metal infused take on black metal, with pieces orientating around a strongly defined melodic character, and the solos are very lyrical. I would say they have a striking character to them, and they're almost anthemic in the way they lead into sort of these link passages and so on. This album in particular, it strips the sort of epic qualities of their previous works back, and makes that almost like an incidental feature of what is essentially a deeper folk orientated piece of historical metal in a lot of ways. And there's also a sharply defined sort of militaristic current to this one that sort of retains a sense of grand epic narrative to it, whilst referencing sort of this almost democratic folk populist undercurrent to it. So it is trying to do a lot across this album. I wouldn't say it's the most enjoyable thing to listen to, but it's definitely intellectually very, very interesting. So this one probably is going in at C as well. Next up, guess where we're going? We're off to Chile. It's Mayhemic. This one is another thrash one, and it bears all the same hallmarks as Critical Defiance as far as Chilean thrash is concerned. And it's, excitable abandon, it's continuity with the past, but it's like boundless creativity. I found it a little less focused than Critical Defiance and indeed Demoniac as well. A little wanting for a unique identity, but that didn't make it any less enjoyable. It's far more than just by the numbers thrash at this point. And it really does kind of reach beyond the rudiments of what their sort of North American and European counterparts often do. There's even some sort of rockist tendencies on here. What do I mean by that? Anthemic, fist pumping, easy to follow verse chorus stuff. But that's supplemented by some really, really intelligent, energetic, and just carefree, creative thrash, let's say. They embody all the exciting and unique elements of that world, and its astute ability to drag old forms, kicking and screaming, into the now. But yeah, not mind-blowing. So let's whack this into B territory. Up it goes. Have we got too many albums to fit on this fucking Mephitis? anyone that followed Hate Meditations for a while will be aware of our relationship with Fighters. We think they're the future of extreme metal. I know there are people that disagree with that, but they are a band from California. They play a form of death metal. In my mind, they call themselves dark metal as sort of a hybrid of black and death metal. But for me, they have more to say to the death metal culture than they do black metal. Even they do borrow heavily from that. And this is their first album since 2021. Essentially, two EPs stuck together, but there is a sort of clear continuity between the two as far as sort of creativity and concept are concerned. And it's all here, like the identity, the world building, this unique tonal language that they have, which I think is the real key element that just sets them apart from other sort of just very good extreme metal of these days. They, in the way that a Demolic or an early At the Gates, an early Sentenced, an early Deicide, Morbid Angel, they all created their own kind of world and tonal language and approach to riffing that was utterly unique, and it kind of, they invited you into this little space that was just unlike any other band that was playing at the time. And Mephitis are one of the few outfits out there working today that you could truly say that about, that's putting out material that inspires that in the listener. There's a clear artistic and intellectual project they wish to undertake with the genres that they work with. It's a sort of meaningful form of communication with history itself. These are things that, yeah, it made the giants of early 90s like death metal unique and enduring, and they're all sorely lacking today, but they're all here in this outfit in Mephitis. And this album, it kind of tries to endear itself to the listener a bit more. Their predecessor, Off Scourings, released in 2021, is probably the superior album in my view, but it's very, very studied and intellectual work, I would say. It takes many, many sit-throughs to kind of get what's going on, but also Mephitis are not a band that one tends to listen to often. It's a very rich and calorific experience. It's like, you know, if you were to eat a chocolate fudge cake every day or something. But this album is one that I studied a great deal on the day that I reviewed it. I was listening to it sort of, I don't know, 6-7 times in a row just to try and grasp what was going on. That's kind of the, not to sound pretentious, that is literally what a Mephitis album takes. But they do engage in a very, very thought-provoking dialogue with the history of extreme metal, and this album did not disappoint in that regard. So this one is obviously going straight in the S tier. Where is it in my list? Cool. Next up. This one was another curveball for me. These guys are from India, Chennai, I believe. Let's look that up, shall we? We've still got Moral. There they are. Moral Puch. Yeah, Chennai. Oh, my memory does serve me. Another one that was like a curveball to me. I'd not heard of these guys before. This is their debut album, self-titled. Basically, a really, really good imitation of Immolation circa Unholy Cult. And they basically, much like my jabber about Chile, these guys just add fuel to my argument that it takes non-Western artists to develop metal at this point. Artists that grew up outside of the epicenters of metal in its heyday. By that I mean Western Europe, North America, parts of Japan, parts of South America, Brazil, for instance. I think that it takes a fresh pair of eyes, cultures that are slightly less decadent, slightly less anxious about nostalgia and the passage of time, to just take a bit more of a free-form, carefree approach to some of these old forms and sort of put a new lick of paint on them, polish them up and shine them up a bit. And this Indian outfit, so they are nominally old school, but such is the sort of identity and life bubbling away on this album that the sort of category is almost by the by at this point, I would say. Obviously, Immolation circa Unholy Cult is the sort of key influence here. But that album in itself almost defined itself by distinguishing itself from death metal at the time. If you think about the early 2000s, it was a remarkably intelligent and complex piece of death metal at the time. And I think Moral Putrefaction, in referencing that, they do right in terms of not reaching for the usual sort of old school, sort of 89 to 93 sort of shelf of death metal, and going for something a little bit more challenging and a little bit more complex. And it definitely comes through on this album. And they do move past that influence at times, but not in a way that satisfied me enough. But as a debut, this was strikingly promising, and I'll be following this artist and have already purchased this album now that it's out on CD. So this one is whacking itself in at C next to the Holy Arrow. Okay. Oh, we've got Valadir there twice. Anyway, we'll come to that. Yeah, a few more to go. Next up is the Old Wains from Russia. Russian black metal. Probably no problematic material here. Old Wains are a good black metal band. Okay, no, we want more substance than that. It's difficult to put your finger on it. Like, they do black metal really, really well. And this is one of those albums that comes along every now and then that it just reminds us that it's not always lack of substantive development with the forms that's the problem. It's the fact that people just don't play them well. Old Wains are a band that play black metal really, really well. The materials, familiar as they are welded together really, really effectively. There's no unique trick to it. There's no gimmick, novelty, or flair. It's just the formula. The same mix of Burzum, Darkthrone, maybe some early Immortal defines the majesty of a lot of Eastern European black metal and Russian black metal as well for some decades now. In that sense, again, it's doing more with less. It's more than the sum of its parts, and it just works in the hands of Old Wains where others fail. That being said, it feels like we're sort of almost being fed just that, a band trying to do black metal really, really well. And I wouldn't say it's probably a bit too harsh to say it's contrived, but it's definitely lacking that zhuzh, that spark, that just makes good albums great, as it were. So I think this is gonna slide into the B's. So there you go, next to the Mayhemic. You're in good company there. Do not worry. Pestilence. These guys have been making waves for a little while, and this is their second album, and it's not a style that I really kind of rate. I would sort of put it maybe Caverncore adjacent, but much more death grind focused. It's not really a doom metal band, more incantation inspired than a lot of death metal, I would say, but it goes for that sort of black and grind undercurrent rather than these long meandering doom segments. And on this album, Pestilence, I think what sets them apart is their sort of atmospheric persistence, which a lot of bands lack, their ability to write a riff, but also their understanding of how the construction of a riff interacts with and affects the guitar tone or the production techniques that you use, and how production can be used as a compositional weapon. The feedback, the trail of influence flows, the traffic of influence flows both ways. And on this album, Pestilence have taken a much more kind of direct, intimate kind of approach to production, in that they've dialed back the reverb. They've gone much more like close with particularly with the drum sound as well. Everything feels a lot more intimate, like you are just listening to a band maybe play in the rehearsal room or something. And I would say that works for them because it sort of allowed them to again focus on the one aspect that was lacking on the last album, which is riffs in particular. And this kind of plays to their strengths in that they take the older language of Death Doom into a modern context. And on here, they sound like a modern but very, very organic, kind of genuine death metal band. And this takes them above mere replication or an over-reliance on sort of swelling chasmic dirge. Sorry, that word was dirge with a Scottish accent. Apologies. Not really a very good Scottish accent as well. Dirge. But anyway, they do this, and a lot of bands do this at the expense of content, but Pestilence avoid that, and ultimately they do deserve praise for pushing and teasing or otherwise disrupting the borders of this field of sort of dark death grind come doom metal thing. But they also perform like a rearguard action of impressive creativity, and not just raising questions of the genre, but furnishing us with possible answers along the way. And the album does have a lackluster midsection, I should say. It gets a little bit post-rocky in places, which is... So this one will remain in the B. Don't touch post-rock Pestilence. There be stagnation. This Croatian oddity, an absolute delight when they landed on my desk. Just some dude putting out really, really weird, dissonant black metal, but one that kind of references, sort of played like Celtic Frost, where as if Celtic Frost had formed in 2015. That's kind of what they sound like. And the world down there, and indeed their entire catalogue, it revamps or maybe regresses even the aesthetic formula of black metal with this pre-Norwegian warmth, and they express this through like an organic mix and bouncier rhythms, again referencing the likes of Celtic Frost or Tormentor or Master's Hammer and stuff. But more importantly, Betrayal, they cast a shadow of traditional melody over the pursuit of pure dissonance. They're not leaning on dissonance entirely. There's this weird sort of peripheral contours of very, very traditional melodies that are always trying to kind of work their way out of the fray and never quite reaching there. It's always this sort of tantric teasing approach that just makes their music so sort of tantalizing and addictive in a lot of ways. And in doing so, they follow this sort of phrasing that is actually quite rare within extreme metal, I would say. So yeah, anything by Betrayal is going straight in S unless they release a total dud. But this one is straight in at S. Yes, it has been a good year. Maybe it's going to just even out by the end on this list here. Another favourite of mine, Polemicist, with a self-titled EP. Long awaited after their 2021 album, this Return of the Sophist. So this is an American black metal duo who are essentially I would say, on the melodic side of the genre. And they take inspiration from the realm of philosophy rather than mythology, or mountain ranges and forests, for instance. So this kind of graduates black metal into a more kind of abstract intellectual pursuit in a lot of ways. And in that sense, the compositions themselves become self-referential. They're embracing kind of dramatic conflict of competing ideologies and concepts. The way the melodies and the tempos kind of conflict with each other is sort of reminiscent of something like early Sacramentum in a lot of ways. And in that sense, it's very hypnotic in its ability to undulate around themes before striking out into surprising directions and sort of surprisingly transparent, expressive forms, I should say. And there's a rich layer cake of music going on anything that Polemisys release, and this EP is no exception. So yeah, also I'm being far too kind this year, but yeah, straight up with this. Slime Lord, fellow Leeds lads. Top quality local lads from Yorkshire. These are the boys from Cryptic Shift, with a sort of working in a Death Doom kind of project for a long time, and they've released quite a few EPs before this, I believe. And whilst they were really interesting, they kind of came across as like a little outlet for the guys, because Cryptic Shift are sort of a very dense, technical, progressive death metal outfit, and it felt like they were kind of doing a Death Doom thing to kind of blow off steam. But with their debut, they've taken it in a very weird, kind of dense direction, but one that's true to the idea of Death Doom, and that it is still very torturous, very sort of teasing, very cloying, but very, very dense and very, very showy at times in a good way. And I would say that this is quite a disruptive work. It disrupts our preconceptions of what artistic governance, or in this case, the governance of Death Doom should be. In that sense, it pleases as much as it does actually frustrate as well. But it takes time to kind of unpick what they're doing on here. I'd say like new angles confront the listener with every fresh listen, and it does raise many questions for those invested in the genre of Death Doom, which I have been for many, many years. And perhaps most importantly, though, it reminds us that despite how cluttered our content feeds have become in this sort of digital age or whatever, but there are still limitless vistas of sonic territory yet to be uncovered if one is creative and sort of innovative enough. So yeah, I would say this one definitely belongs on the A tier there, and we are running out of room on the A tier. So what happens if I just put one? Oh, it just thickens out the A tier. Okay. Next up, Greek black metal, Sorgalig. Now, this is modern Greek black metal, so don't go to this EP expecting anything like, your Varifrons or your Necromantias or your Samiles or Agatuses or whatever. This is basically Gorgoroth, early Gorgoroth. And the reason I love this album, I love Sorgalig in general. They're not particularly like wildly innovative or anything, but they just remind me that black metal's going to be okay. I know we're all worried about it. We always worry about it. It's a problem child, but it's going to be all right. Don't you worry. And this may be purely anecdotal based on the vibes that I get from like the internet or the spaces that I move in, but it feels like black metal's popularity is waning, and I think that is a good thing for the genre. Like, finally sort of unshackled from the scrutiny of the post black metal gaze, the post-gaze, black gaze stuff going on that was sort of huge in the late 2000s and 2010s. And it's sort of free to be itself again. At the moment, it feels like death metal is the one that's really kind of under the spotlight at the moment, with the likes of the Blood Incantations and the Two Molds and the Necrots and the other one. What's the other one? I can't remember now. But anyway, I mean, sure, there are still Goliaths of black metal that will release an album and everyone will, they'll suck out all the oxygen, your Watanes or whatever. whenever they decide to resurface, they'll take up all the airwaves. But at the grassroots level, the underground level, it feels like black metal is feeling a bit freer, a bit looser, a bit kind of more spontaneous, and dare we say it, creative. It's feeling a bit more daring, I'd say. And there's nothing particularly revolutionary going on, as this Sorg League album attests to. It's just the fact that black metal is just being good at what it does, I would say. There's this easy accommodation of the sensationalism and the theatrics that come with the genre. It makes it vulnerable to fads, any fad that anyone wishes to thrust on it, which is why it has had many disasters over the years, both sort of communally and intellectually. But I would say that at the moment it's in some sort of holding pattern, and I think the return of a band like Sorgelig putting out an album of this quality in a very, very traditional sort of Gorgoroth-esque field of just very energetic, feral, riff-based black metal is kind of testament to that. It's an outlying piece of data, or is it an outlying piece of data? I think it's a source of a newfound confidence within black metal, and I lack the statistics to say this with certainty, but this album is a welcome return to the solid, unoriginal, swaggering fury of the latter days of the Norwegian scene as it was in the mid-90s, I would say, with a dash of character and theatrics thrown in for good measure. But we still must mark it down for the lack of originality. So this one's going in at C, next to the old Moral Putrefaction. Next up, Sylvain.
Dagsens auger sloknar ut. Kvelds og livet sterke lare. Skukken sig fra dal til nu.
Neo-folk. We always have a couple of ambient neo-folks in the list. We've had our Dead Space chamber music. This was the other one. Quite light on this actually this year. Normally I have 3 or 4. This time I've only got 2. But this one again was not expecting anything of this album, given that it came out on Season of Mist, which reliably releases warm diarrhea that it wants to inject directly into your eyeball. But in this case, they put out a quality EP here, and this artist's album prior to this was dog shit. But when it goes into pure ambient neo-folk territory without even referencing what they think might appeal to a metal audience, it's actually pretty darn good. It's unassuming neo-folk, very, very ethereal, very, very haunting, and I think it's that aspect that will ingratiate it most to a metal audience. They'll appreciate both the excavation of pre-modern musical forms and the elegantly simple structuralism that quietly defies the underlying entropy of the music itself, and it offers a kind of a respite from the music that we normally listen to. So again, this one is going to slot next to the Sorgelig, I think. Quality output, but not quite there. Next up,
upon the plain between the hemispheres.
again, pretty lacking on the classic metal front for me as well. This is probably the only release that doesn't have distorted vocals, I think. Void Moon. Normally I have a handful of heavy metal or doom metal, classic doom metal releases going in my list, but this year not to be. But Void Moon did pique my interest just for the fact that they have this very clear and crisp approach to melodic doom metal that's replete with this bouncy and pompous kind of swagger to it that really kind of sets itself apart. And Void Moon are essentially back to basics heavy metal, although the fact that they play at slightly depressed tempos means we have to class them as doom metal. Not really, but whatever. But there's no frills, no keyboards, no flashy theatrics. It's just riffs, very, very intelligently written solos, quality vocals, and narrative lyrics that are told through this soaring metal kind of crooning style that's unapologetically showy alongside the guitar solos. It's just a very, very tight package that works really, really well. So yeah, I was going to put this lower down, but I think I'm going to put it in the B because I can. I've done this out of order, so we're just going to step back to VA now and talk about an Italian black metal band called Valadir. This was technically released in 2023, but it got a physical release this year. On, I shall tell you the label. This was one of those Bandcamp only digital releases in 2023. It's not even there. I only gave it 78. All right, let me just bring up my post on it. Black Mass Prayers, that's the name of the label. Yeah, they put it out on CD, which I purchased. Thoroughly good. Why did it catch me off guard so much? Well, it's sort of medieval, folky black metal, but not shit. It's a curiosity of actually existing good medievalist black metal. Kind of reminded me of Demon Sea in the way that it sort of crafts these utterly kind of terrifying and quite violent bass-driven melodies, sort of very dirgy black metal. And that's kind of enhanced by the fact that I think they're using programmed drums, so the rhythm is very, very persistent, very, very constant. And they know how to work in an exciting kind of almost lyrical, but very, very darkly lyrical guitar lines, melodic currents alongside this kind of very regular rhythmic pulse. But they intercut this with these long kind of interludes of medieval music, essentially. And yeah, obviously sort of samples of clashing of swords and medieval battle and so on. And it's a really kind of good mix of visceral, dark black metal alongside what feels like soundtrack music. You got Summoning meets Demon Sea, basically. And it relies on its own ability to compose and communicate these ideas without leaning on the sort of shared symbology of pure pastiche to draw on its audience. This isn't, I mean, they do look like LARPers in the way that they dress for their promo shoots, but they are not merely LARPers with folk instruments. They're much, much more than that. And I think just a cursory listen will kind of bear me out on this one. And this album, it really does improve on repeated listens. I've had this on repeat almost for the last month or so, I would say. And maybe there is a bit of lack of focus here and there, and over-reliance on interludes. Maybe it's a little bit clumsy, but, you know, one could also read it as charming in a lot of ways. And for me, this is a contender for Album of the Year above and beyond the Mephitis. So that's going straight up to the S tier. So, finally, we have for us... Desolate Eternities. This is a Romanian death metal outfit who were very, very typical with some oddities to them. There's austere death metal, but it builds a platform out of this absurdity. It builds a platform out of this absurdly basic approach to riff construction. And it uses this to launch itself into loosely defined melodic material. Approach to narrative kind of takes the form of constructing incidental licks more than fully formed riffs in a lot of ways, but it builds this into very, very kind of weird idiosyncratic currents. I think it's a very, very strange, odd album, but one that's maybe a little bit lax in focus. So yeah, released back in March, so I had to sort of cast my mind back to sort of re-listen to this one to see if it was a contender. But yeah, after a few listens, I was like, yeah, there is something to this. It bores more than it dazzles in a lot of ways, but it's definitely worthy of. It's definitely got a little check mark next to it as like, I would love to see what this artist does next, because there's something there that is definitely worth paying attention to in a really kind of lo-fi DIY death metal sense. But yeah, I would say there's probably. No, you know what? It's going on the C tier. It's going on the C tier. Cool. So, thank you. Oh, we need to scroll down a bit because we're missing out our albums. There they all are. Happy as can be. So, thank you very much. That was my 2024. I hope you enjoyed the tier list. Why don't you tell me about the albums you've been enjoying? Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for paying attention this year. If you have been, or if you're new to the channel, welcome, and thank you for getting this far into the video. I hope that you have a wonderful new year, but ultimately this platform exists with the sole purpose of platforming quality music for all of the think pieces I put out. That's my sole intention, is to shine a light on music that I think deserves that light. So thank you again to all the bands for the wonderful music you've presented this year.